Alright guys, Mouse here again. In this video, we're going to break down Soyeon, the new Windbreaker, and if she's actually better than Goto Ryuji, and if she's even worth pulling for. We'll cover her skills, her buff, do some quick theory crafting, and I will also share damage test results in Guild Boss, combat example in the workshop. Then I'll give my predictions for Power of Destruction since we can't test it yet this week. Before we dive in though, if your support is still free, please consider supporting me in the SLA Content Creator Program. It would really help me a lot. Big thanks to everyone, especially our top 10 supporters here, my guildmates, and of course Mr. Bombastic, who's always in the #1 spot and very close to 1-year supporter now. Again, thanks so much to all of you guys. And also just real quick, we have a few slots available in the guild. If you want to play with some of the best and active competitive players, you may apply in my Discord server. Link is in the description. Alright, let's start with her kit. Her damage skills are not the focus, but here's the quick summary. Her version 2 skills that say increase damage by certain amount scale well because they're not additive with skill type multipliers like those from Desire Set or Destructive Instinct or buffs from Gina. However, her core attack damage from Magnum Chain will be additive and will have diminishing returns. Now, her main support value comes from her buffs and debuffs, and here's the first big issue that I found. I tested her support skill Underdog, which looks similar to the This Battle debuff. It's supposed to give 8% wind damage taken, but when I stacked it with Grim, the actual increase is still 24%. And usually, this suggests that it's likely additive with elemental damage increase instead, like the scam versions we found from Shuhua, the Alon's Orb, and recently from Mini. So the effect is not as strong as it looks. Just for context, Soren's Sub-Zero Water damage taken debuff, if you test it, will give you a pure solid increase, except if you stack something of the same type like the Grim. On the bright side though, I tested this just out of curiosity. Stormbringer works fine, same as Grim and Soren, no problem here. It's a true elemental damage taken debuff. Now, just for reference, to see how she actually performs, what you're seeing here is just a breakdown of buffs and passives in a typical Guild Boss setup. For Goto Ryuji, he's a 24% increased damage buff in the 3rd slot, increases Leonard's damage by around 13%. He also adds a bit of basic skill damage from the Arrogance buff, and for the crit damage part, this works well in this particular GB setup since the crit chance is high with Libora and Chahe in play. For Soyeon, her 30% basic skill buff looks big, but only translates to about 12%, and her 15% ultimate buff adds around 7%, plus some elemental damage and her debuff. On paper, her buffs looks like a lot of percentage, but it's actually not that impressive because of diminishing returns since we're using Infamy set here, and we also stacked a lot of wind elemental damage. Even so, her contribution spreads team-wide because of her debuff, so that's what makes the difference for her. For the test results, we got to Ryuji, Leonard averaged around 9 billion, Gina was around 3 billion, and with Soyeon replacing Goto, Leonard's damage increased slightly, about 300 to 500 million more, but Gina's damage increased consistently, reaching 3.5 to 3.7 billion. Soyeon obviously will improve Leonard's damage, but the big difference will be on Gina, because Goto's huge damage increase buff is only limited to one Hunter in the 3rd slot. And by the way, this particular test positioned Gina in the 3rd slot for power gauge because sometimes she also gets delayed. But when I switch it over, Leonard's damage did not seem to change but reached 10 billion plus once, probably an RNG, I'm not sure. But overall, results were still close and more testing is needed to see which slot benefits most. Because remember, once we remove Goto Ryuji, Leonard's A3 effect will not be as fast anymore without the skill spamming. I also tried splitting them, Soyeon in Team B just for her debuff, Goto in Team A, and in that setup, Gina's damage dropped while Leonard and Goto's damage remained almost the same. So why did we not see some crazy damage output when everyone's in play? This happened probably because number 1, we replaced Hansemi, who already had a 5% damage taken debuff in the first place, so technically we only added additional 5%. And number 2, the elemental debuff might actually be the scam version, and I do feel like it's the scam version because otherwise we would have seen huge amount of increase, but we did not see that. So the key takeaway here, Soyeon did improve the win team with a Jinwoo support setup, especially Gina's damage, but I also forgot to mention that this test did not use Stormbringer, Vacuum Wave, and Cold Ice, so we can expect less impact from Soyeon because of too much increased damage taken stacking. I still need to do an actual lineup test, however, overall, initially, it feels like the impact is not on a game-changing level. Now for dungeons, also important, especially in the Wind Workshop. Here we don't use the Infamy set, usually it's Obsidian, and now I use Iron Will with Leonard, and by the way, now works fine after the artifact change. So adding lots of these damage increases, especially from the Obsidian set, including the Blessing set of course from Gina, lowers the value of Goto's damage increase buff, and crit is way harder against high level monsters and without crit debuffer. So overall, in theory, Goto's value will be less here in these kinds of dungeons, while Soyeon's buff benefit more without heavy diminishing returns after removing Infamy and all of those elemental damage stacking that we usually get in the guild boss. So on paper, we can expect Soyeon to shine here more, but in practice, it was a different story in my experience because apparently she's too squishy. Being an attack unit, she dies too easily after a few hits, which makes her difficult to play and able to complete her full rotation. But in terms of breaking potential, Soyeon looks slightly stronger at wiping the bar in one rotation, but her survivability issues erase that advantage, I feel, because afterwards it's really hard to pull off her damage and full rotation, unlike Goto Ryuji, who can tank a lot of damage and comfortably complete his full damage rotation. Anyway, even in perfect scenario, in perfect circumstances, I feel like Soyeon, if ever she would have an advantage, it will not be again in a game-changing level. So my verdict, on paper, she's better, but in practice, I feel like she's too unreliable and I would not recommend her for this purpose. Now for the power of destruction, just some predictions. We can't test Wind POD yet, but here's what I expect. Goto gives Leonard his usual buffs plus the Tyrant's Path, which adds 12% damage in break state. So that might also be a skill type buff. I'll just test that later. But Soyeon, on the other hand, should help more with AoE breaking since her debuff can apply to both hands. However, her damage taken increase debuff might not affect the head much because the boss already has high damage taken there. But the real difference here that I'm expecting will be on Jinwoo. And the reason is, Goto Ryuji does not really buff Jinwoo much because most of his buffs are wind units only. On the other hand, Soyeon's buffs are team-wide, which might potentially give her the edge in POD hard mode. And that being said, we might even possibly open up a potential for a Jinwoo DPS in the guild boss, which is something that I will also be interested in testing over the next few days. Now for the build, it's pretty straightforward. For the sets, it's just Greed or Desire. Greed is usually better since Wind struggles with crit rate. And for the cores, the only important thing here is either you use Ancient Wraith or Eyes of the Watcher. But Ancient Wraith is my pick because it boosts all damage types and the attack percent will not have a lot of diminishing returns because Soyeon does not have much. Eyes of the Watcher is okay, but I feel like it might be harder to utilize because Wind crit is very unreliable, especially against high level monsters. So do I recommend Soyeon for guild boss? I think there will be a slight increase because she can help Gina and will provide team-wide buffs. But whether or not it's worth spending your resources on this, especially if you're not a whale, it's something that I would probably not recommend. For the dungeons, I think she's too squishy to recommend, honestly. So I would want to use Goto more in those kinds of situations because it's more chill and I don't have to be stressed about dodging all the time and thinking about not dying. For POD, I'm expecting it to be worth it, but still needs real combat tests once the Wind POD becomes available. Overall, it feels like she's designed to support Leonard, but Goto Ryuji, I feel, is already enough for most players. She might be a better support for Mirei over Goto Ryuji because we will not have that MP consumption debuff, and of course Soyeon also gives a bit of MP. If you're planning to pull for her, minimum advancement I think is A3. It's required if you want to replace Goto Ryuji for the power gauge gain, but even at A5 I feel like she still feels questionable and I would think twice about pulling for her if I already have Goto Ryuji. So yeah, that's it for now. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.